The lawyer's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and Nora Alcott stood very still near the window while her brother signed his name to papers that should never have existed. Outside, Savannah moved through its morning. Merchants opened their shops. A wagon loaded with cotton bales rolled slowly down the cobblestone street. A woman in a blue dress walked her dog along the sidewalk, unhurried, as though the world were a perfectly reasonable place. Nora watched all of it without seeing any of it. She was 32 years old, and in the time it took her brother Harlan to lift his pen from that paper, she became a woman who owned nothing. Nothing except 47 acres of saltwater marsh 8 miles southeast of the city. She did not cry. She had decided somewhere in the sleepless weeks leading up to this morning that she would not give Harlan the satisfaction of her tears. She had already spent too many tears on things she could not change. She had cried for Owen, her husband dead 14 months from a fever that came on fast and left fast and took him with it. She had cried for her father gone since July, quiet at the end, his hands folded over his chest like a man who had already made his peace. She had no more tears to spend on a brother who had planned this moment long before either of those graves were dug. Harlan set down the pen and looked up at her. He had the satisfied expression of a man who had solved a difficult problem, which was exactly how he saw this. Not theft, problem solving. "This is the cleanest outcome for everyone," he said. Nora said nothing with done. "You have to understand the debt was real. Owen's signature was on the note. 2 witnesses saw him sign it." Nora said nothing. "The marsh property has potential. Father always said the coastal land would appreciate in time." The lawyer, a thin man named Aldridge, who had been staring at his desk throughout this exchange, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was not a bad man. He had told her privately the week before that the promissory note troubled him, that the timing of its appearance troubled him, that a great many things about Harlan Alcott's claim troubled him. But the law was the law, and the signature was the signature, and the witnesses had sworn on their immortal souls, and there was nothing Aldridge could do except be troubled quietly and process the paperwork. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" Nora asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Aldridge just shook his head. Nora picked up the deed to the marsh property from the corner of the desk where it had been placed for her. She folded it once precisely and tucked it into the front pocket of her coat. Then she walked out of the lawyer's office without looking at her brother again. She never looked at him again for a very long time. There is a particular quality to a Georgia morning in October, a sharpness in the air that is not quite committed to cold, a light that falls at an angle that makes everything look slightly more serious than it did in summer. Nora walked through it without purpose for a while, moving through the streets of Savannah, because she needed to be moving, needed the physical sensation of forward motion, even when nothing about her situation was moving forward. She was thinking about Owen, not about his death, which she had thought about so many times that the shape of it was worn smooth in her mind like a river stone. She was thinking about something he had said to her in the first year of their marriage, when a late frost had killed most of the vegetable crop and they were facing a lean winter. She had been 24 years old and frightened, and Owen had sat across from her at the kitchen table and said with absolute certainty that the only people who were truly defeated were the ones who decided they were. She had believed him then. She believed him now, standing on a Savannah Street corner with a deed to a worthless swamp in her coat pocket and not a single cent to her name. Owen had been wrong about a great many things in his life. He had been wrong about the weather more times than she could count, wrong about which fields to plant, and when wrong about the horse he bought from a man in Augusta who had clearly seen him coming. But he had not been wrong about that. Nora bought a cup of coffee from a street vendor, with the last of the coins in her purse, stood drinking it in the October light, and began to think. She had known the debt was fabricated the moment Harlan produced the note. Not because she could prove it in a court of law, not because she had any evidence she could lay before a judge, but because she knew Owen Alcott down to his bones, and Owen Alcott had never gambled in his life. He had been, if she was honest, somewhat boring about his virtues. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not chase other women or spend money they did not have on things they did not need. He worked the land 6 days a week and rested on the 7th, and kept meticulous accounts of every transaction the farm had ever made. When Nora had told him early in their marriage that a little gambling might make him more interesting, he had looked at her with such genuine confusion that she had burst out laughing, and he had joined her a moment later without entirely understanding the joke. The signature on Harlan's promissory note had been Owen's signature. She was certain of that. The shape of the letters, the slight leftward lean, the particular way he crossed his T, it was Owen's hand, which meant Harlan had not forged it himself. He had found someone skilled enough to copy it, practiced enough to produce a document that could pass examination. He had done this, Nora understood, before Owen was even sick. He had planned this years in advance, waiting for the right moment, waiting for their father to die without a will and leave behind an estate that could be disputed. The witnesses were men she did not know. They had given their testimony without looking at her. That too told her something. The judge had not been cruel. He had been careful, walking through the law the way a man walks through a dark room he knows well enough not to need a lamp. The debt exceeded half the farm's assessed value. Under Georgia statute, the estate could not be divided until debts were settled. Nora could buy out Harlan's claim and satisfy the debt simultaneously in amount exceeding $2,000, or she could accept the alternative Harlan had proposed, the marsh property and her freedom from the debt. She had accepted. She had not accepted because she was defeated. She had accepted because she was 32 years old, and she had learned in those 14 months of running the farm alone after Owen died that there was no virtue in fighting battles you could not win. You saved your strength. You chose your ground. Her ground, as it turned out, would be 47 acres of saltwater marsh that nobody else wanted. She rode out to see it on a borrowed horse in the first week of November, on a morning cold enough that her breath made small clouds in the air. The wagon track that served as a road to the property was deeply rutted and crossed twice by low areas that flooded at high tide, forcing her to wait both times while the water receded enough to pass. An hour of riding and the track simply ended at the edge of a world that seemed to have no use for human presence. Cordgrass stretched in every direction, tall and pale, in the November light, moving in the salt wind with a sound like distant applause. The tidal creeks wound between the grass beds in patterns that looked random from the bank, but she suspected followed some logic she did not yet understand. The smell was strong salt and mud and something organic underneath, rich and ancient. Pluff mud, they called it on the coast, the dark, silty soil that made up the marsh floor, soft enough to swallow a man to his knees if he stepped in the wrong place. The deed had described the property as unsuitable for cultivation or habitation. Nora dismounted and tied the horse to a piece of driftwood that had wedged itself against the bank years ago and then been colonized by mussels and barnacles until it looked like part of the marsh itself. She stood at the water's edge and looked. Most people she understood would have seen nothing here. Harlan had certainly seen nothing here. That was the entire point of giving it to her. Her father had accepted this land years ago, in payment for a bad loan, had kept it in the family, the way people keep things that might someday be useful, which is to say without expectation and without particular care. It was a liability on the tax rolls and a footnote in the family's holdings, and Harlan had handed it over as a fig leaf of generosity over the naked fact of his theft. But Nora was standing at the edge of this marsh and thinking about old Cato. She had been perhaps 12 years old the first time she met him. Her father had brought her along on a trip to deliver produce to a trading post near the coast, and while her father conducted his business, Nora had wandered down to the water's edge where an old man was working on his nets. He was Gala, part of the community, descended from the enslaved Africans, brought to work the coastal rice plantations, people who had stayed in these marshes through everything and learned to read them the way scholars read books. Old Cato had the kind of face that made you think of weather, lined and dark and calm, with eyes that seemed to be evaluating something just past the horizon. He had not seemed particularly interested in a 12-year-old girl watching him work, but when she asked him what he was looking for when he looked at the water, he had actually stopped and considered the question. "You see the color," he said, pointing to where the creek ran between two stands of grass. She had seen a creek. "The dark water there where it moves fast, that's where the channel runs deep. Cold down there, clean. Things that like cold, clean water, that's where they go." He had paused. "You ever eat an oyster?" She had not. He had pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, walked to where a cluster of shells clung to the bank, and pried one open with the casual expertise of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He had held it out to her. She had hesitated. He had waited. She had eaten it. Salt in the sea and something underneath that she did not have a word for. "Good water makes good oysters," old Cato said. "You can taste the water in them. Taste where they come from. These here, they come from good water. He looked at her steadily. Most people walk by these creeks and see nothing. Learning to see what's actually there, that's the whole thing, girl. That's everything. She had been 12 years old, and those words had lodged themselves somewhere in the back of her mind, filed away as interesting but irrelevant to a farm girl's life. 20 years later, standing at the edge of her marsh on a cold November morning, she found them again. She walked down to the water. At low tide, the creek banks were exposed, and Nora could see the oysters. They grew in massive clusters that rose from the mud like gray fortresses, the older shells thick and deeply ridged, younger oysters attached to them in layers one generation building on the last. The clusters created their own small ecosystems. She could see crabs moving between the shells, small fish darting in the shallow water, a heron standing motionless further down the bank, with the patience of something that has never once doubted its own purpose. She found her father's old folding knife in her coat pocket. She had carried it since he died without quite deciding to the way you carry certain things when you are trying to hold on to something that cannot be held. She opened it, crouched at the water's edge, and worked the blade into the seam of one of the oysters the way old Cato had shown her 2 decades ago. The shell opened. The meat was plump and pale in the gray November light. She brought it to her lips. Sweet, clean, the taste of good water. Nora sat back on her heels in the mud and stayed very still for a moment. And then she laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a controlled one. It was the kind of laugh that comes out of you when something genuinely surprises you, when the world does something you were not expecting, when you realize that the worst thing that has happened to you might also improbably be something else entirely. She was sitting in the mud of a worthless swamp, and she was laughing, and for the first time since Owen died, it did not feel like an act of will to keep going. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. She spent 2 full days exploring the property before she began to understand what she had. The creek system on her land connected to the Wilmington River, which meant constant tidal flushing. The marsh breathed in and out twice a day, pulling in nutrient-rich water from the ocean and then releasing it a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Old Cato had explained this to her once. The oysters that grew in waters with strong tidal flow were better fed, cleaner, better flavored than oysters in quieter water. They grew in colder, faster water, and the cold and the speed made them what they were. She mapped the property by walking it, which meant getting her boots thoroughly destroyed in the pluff mud and spending one terrifying moment when she stepped off an invisible edge and went in up to her knee and had to use her walking stick and a great deal of undignified flailing to extract herself. She made notes on a piece of paper she had brought for the purpose, marking the locations of the major creek systems, the deepest channels, the areas where the oysters grew in the greatest concentration. On the second day, she found the midden. It rose from the western edge of the marsh where the ground lifted slightly, not much, barely a suggestion of elevation, but enough. Over centuries, perhaps longer, the native people who had worked these waters before any European arrived had discarded their oyster shells in this place, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, until the accumulated shells had compressed and solidified into something almost like stone. Time and weather and the slow work of rain had carved into the face of this midden, creating a natural alcove roughly 8 feet high, 10 feet deep, 12 feet wide. Nora stood in the entrance of this space and looked at it for a long time. She had been preparing herself for the task of building a shelter from driftwood and marsh grass, something that would keep the rain off while she figured out what to do next. She had not been preparing herself for this, a ready-made dwelling that needed modification rather than construction. From nothing, its walls packed solid as concrete, from the weight of centuries, its position on the slight rise, protecting it from the tidal flooding that covered the rest of the property twice a day. She ran her hand along the shell wall. Smooth in some places, rough in others, the individual shells still visible in the compressed mass, stacked and interlocked like the work of builders who understood what they were doing. People had lived here before, had worked these waters before, had eaten these oysters and built these walls from the evidence of their meals, and understood something about this place that the people who came after them had forgotten. "All right," Nora said aloud to the midden, to the marsh, to Owen's memory, to whoever might be listening. All right. She worked for a week making the midden habitable. She cleared debris from the cave floor, hauled in dry grass for bedding, and found 3 miles upriver the remains of an abandoned rice mill, where she salvaged enough timber to reinforce the entrance and build a proper door frame. The timber was weathered but solid, the kind of heart pine that gets harder with age rather than softer. She built the door from split driftwood and woven cordgrass packed tightly enough to block the wind. It would not win any architectural prizes. It's sealed well enough. She built the hearth into the rear of the cave using creek stones and clay. She dug from the bank, angling the rough chimney she constructed up through a gap in the midden face. When she lit the first fire in the third week of November, the smoke drew cleanly and the heat stayed, and Nora sat on her canvas tick stuffed with dried grass and looked at the flames for a long time. She had spent less than $3. She had a dwelling, a water source, a tidal food supply, and 47 acres of productive oyster habitat that everyone in Savannah believed was worthless. She also had no boat, no harvesting equipment, no established relationships with buyers, no experience as a businesswoman, no reputation in any trade, and no money to acquire any of these things. She was 32 years old, and she was starting from less than nothing, in the literal sense that nothing would have been an improvement over negative $2,000 of implied debt that her brother had arranged for Owen's ghost to carry. The isolation was something she had not fully anticipated. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, a fisherman who worked the sounds and rarely came inland. At night, the marsh made sounds, wind through the cordgrass, the splash of fish, the call of night herons, the deeper silence underneath all of it. She had grown up surrounded by the sounds of farm life, and this quiet had a physical quality, like something pressing against her from all sides. She lay awake those first nights and let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her. Not just the land and the house, but the continuity, the connection to the place where her father and her grandfather had worked, where she and Owen had built their life together, where every field and fence line and worn spot on the kitchen floor had a story she knew. Harlan had severed all of that with forged documents and bought witnesses and the casual cruelty of someone who believes that wanting something enough justifies taking it. She felt this fully and let herself feel it and did not look away from it. And then in the deep quiet of the marsh night, she set it aside. Not forever, not completely, but she set it aside the way you set aside anything too heavy to carry when you need your hands free for work. She could pick it up again later if she wanted to. She suspected she would not want to. The boat took 3 weeks. She had watched boats being built as a child, had helped her father repair the small, flat-bottomed bateau they kept for fishing, had some understanding of how boards came together to form something watertight and stable enough for the shallow tidal creeks she would need to work. Understanding something and doing it are separated by a considerable distance, and Nora covered that distance through trial and significant error. She had a saw, a hammer, and a draw knife from the small collection of tools she had managed to retain when Harlan divided the farm equipment. She had pine trees at the edge of the high ground on her property. She had time and no alternative. The first hole she shaped was wrong. She could see it even as she built it, the asymmetry that would make it pull left in the water, the seams that would not close properly because she had cut the planks at the wrong angle. She took it apart and used the boards again. The second attempt was better. She worked from first light until the light failed, ate oysters she harvested by hand from the nearest bank, drank water from a creek she had tested carefully, and found fresh enough, slept on her grass mattress, and started again the next morning. On the 19th day, she dragged the completed boat to the water's edge and pushed it in. It floated. It sat level. It took water only in the smallest amounts at 2 seams she knew needed recaulking with the oakum she had made from unraveled rope and the pine tar she had rendered from fallen timber. She did the recaulking that afternoon and pushed it in again the next morning. It floated. It sat level. It was 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, and it would not have impressed anyone who knew boats, but it would carry her and her harvest through the tidal creeks without drowning her, and that was precisely what she required. She loaded it with the wooden-handled fork she had fashioned into a crude rake and pushed off from the bank into the creek. The tide was going out, the water dropping, the oyster beds beginning to expose themselves along the channel edges. The smell of the marsh was everywhere. The heron she had been watching for 2 weeks lifted from its post upstream and flew off on slow, deliberate wing beats as though she had interrupted something private. Nora worked the nearest bed, using the rake to break apart clusters and sort them by size, piling the keepable ones in the boat's flat bottom. The shells were sharp enough to cut through her canvas gloves. The clusters were heavy and awkward. Her back began to ache within the first hour. The tide was still falling, which gave her time, but the window for shallow water harvest was limited. When the tide turned and rose again, the work would become impossible and then dangerous. She managed 3 bushels before the water pushed her back. Her hands were bleeding through the gloves. Her back was communicating its displeasure in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. 3 bushels of oysters sat in the bottom of her homemade boat, and she had no idea if 3 bushels was worth the trip into Savannah. She sat in the boat for a moment with her bleeding hands in her lap, looking at the harvest. The afternoon light was coming low and gold across the cordgrass. A red-winged blackbird landed on the bow of the boat and looked at her with one bright eye, then flew away. 3 bushels. She would learn the tides. She would learn the beds. She would learn which water ran deepest, which channels stayed navigable through the low tide where the best oysters grew, and how to reach them without wasting time. She would get faster. She would get stronger. Her hands would callous over the cuts and stop bleeding. She picked up the oar and headed back toward the bank. The trip to Savannah took most of a morning. She had borrowed a small wagon from the fisherman 4 miles away, a man named Amos, who had looked at her situation with the practical sympathy of someone who understood hard circumstances, asked no unnecessary questions, and offered the wagon without being asked. She loaded her bushels and drove the 8 miles to the city, arriving at the waterfront district where the oyster dealers conducted their business. The first dealer she approached had a warehouse that smelled of the sea and old ice. He looked at Nora the way people sometimes look at things that don't fit their expectations, not unkindly but with the careful assessment of a man recalibrating his assumptions. He examined her clothes, which were practical and permanently stained with pluff mud. He looked at her hands wrapped in bandaging over the cuts. He asked where her harvest had come from. She told him. He knew the property. He knew it as the marshland Oldo Alcott had taken. In a bad debt years ago, the property that had recently been transferred to. He paused, doing the arithmetic. The daughter, the widow, the owner, Nora said. He offered her 30 cents a bushel. She knew it was half the standard rate. She knew it because she had spent her time in Savannah carefully before this visit, asking questions and listening to conversations and reading the price boards in the warehouse district with the attention of someone who understood that knowledge was the only currency she currently had. 30 cents was what you offered someone who had no leverage and no alternatives. She had no leverage and no alternatives. "I'll take it," she said. She took the 90 cents and drove back to the marsh. But she paid attention to everything she had seen in that warehouse, how the oysters were sorted, which sizes commanded premium prices, which hotel and restaurant buyers came to collect, how the dealers talked about their best suppliers. She listened to the conversations happening around her with the patient attention of a woman filing information away for future use. On the drive back, she passed a German man loading crates into a wagon outside a neighboring warehouse. He glanced at her load, then looked again with the more focused attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. He said nothing. She said nothing. She drove on. His name, she would learn later, was Dietrich Vogel. He had been in the oyster business in Savannah for 15 years. The winter came in hard that year. January brought cold that froze the marsh grass and made the creek surfaces mirror flat in the mornings. Ice formed in the shallow portions of the tidal flats, and Nora broke through it with her rake to reach the beds. She wrapped her hands in strips of wool cut from an old blanket and worked through cold that made the shells more brittle and the clusters more difficult to handle without shattering the smaller oysters she needed to leave in place. She developed a cough in the second week of January that settled into her chest and stayed for 3 weeks. She worked through it. Not because she was particularly brave or indifferent to discomfort, she was neither, but because stopping meant no income and no income meant no food. And those were the terms of her situation stated plainly. She ate oysters and cornmeal and whatever she could trap in the marsh. She made coffee from roasted acorns and burned fish oil in her lamp and patched her clothes until the patches outnumbered the original fabric. She kept a ledger. Every expense, every sale, every note about which beds produced and at what tides and in what weather. She wrote down what she observed about the water and the oysters when the salinity changed after heavy rains, how that affected the taste, which sections of her creek system produced the sweetest meat, and which produced larger but brinier oysters. She was not a scientist and did not think of herself as one. She was a woman who had grown up keeping farm accounts and understood that the difference between a farm that survived and one that failed was almost always whether the farmer knew what was actually happening versus what they assumed was happening. The cold broke in late February. The marsh came back to itself, birds returned in numbers. The cordgrass began its slow green return at the base, the water warmed by degrees that she could not measure but could feel. In March, Dietrich Vogel stopped her outside his warehouse as she was unloading. "You're from the Alcott Marsh," he said. It was not a question. "I am." He was a broad man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who had spent years near water and the careful eyes of someone who had built a business through attention rather than luck. He asked her several questions, the specific location of her beds relative to the Wilmington River, the tidal patterns, the depth of her main channels. She answered carefully, sharing enough to establish credibility without revealing anything she considered proprietary. At the end of this exchange, Dietrich Vogel offered her 40 cents a bushel. She took it. By the end of March, he was offering 50, the same rate as the established oysterman. She understood what the increase meant. It meant her product was consistently good enough that he would rather pay the standard rate and secure the supply than continue trying to get it cheaper and risk losing it. It meant she had established herself, at least in his estimation, as a supplier worth keeping. She used the increased income to buy proper equipment. A set of iron-tined oyster rakes, heavier canvas gloves with leather reinforcement, a tarpaulin to cover her harvest during transport, protecting the oysters from sun and wind and keeping them alive and saleable for longer. She bought salt pork and real coffee and cornmeal in quantities rather than the small amounts her earlier earnings had allowed. She saved everything else. In April, she made a purchase that changed everything. A set of proper oyster tongs, long wooden handles with iron basket heads that worked like scissors, allowing her to reach oysters growing 6 and 8 feet below the surface in the deeper channels she had mapped over the winter. Beds that had never been harvested. Oysters that had been growing undisturbed for years, large and perfect in the cold, deep water. The tongs cost $2.75. Within a week, they had paid for themselves twice over. Dietrich Vogel began requesting her deeper water oysters, specifically setting them aside for his best restaurant accounts. She was now earning more in a single week than she had in her first month of operation. And in the spring evenings, after the day's harvesting was done and the boat was cleaned and the ledger was updated, Nora began to experiment. She had been watching the way oysters colonized surfaces in the creek, not just the natural beds, but any hard surface that stayed submerged. Rocks, submerged logs, the rotting pilings of an old dock she had found at the far edge of her property. The oyster larvae drifting in the water attached to anything solid they could find, and if the conditions were right, they grew. She began collecting the shells from her harvest and from the midden at the cave entrance, carrying them in the boat to locations in the creek system she had identified as optimal, the right tidal flow, the right depth, the right salinity. She arranged them in rough rows along the creek bottom, providing clean, hard substrate where the water conditions were best. It seemed, she admitted to herself, like a somewhat peculiar thing to do. She had no evidence it would work. She had only the observation that oysters grew on surfaces and the logical extension of that observation into the question of what would happen if she put the right surfaces in the right places. She did it anyway. She recorded it in her ledger. She waited. The spring of 1890 stretched out ahead of her. The marsh greened and warmed. The birds came back in force. The tidal creeks ran clear and cold from the ocean twice a day, carrying with them the microscopic life that everything in the marsh ultimately depended on. Nora worked her beds and tended her experimental rows and kept her accounts and watched the water, learning what it had to teach her. She realized in those quiet spring evenings on the water, almost happy. It was not the happiness she had expected her life to contain. It was not what she had imagined when she and Owen had sat at the kitchen table, making plans for the farm, talking about the future with the easy confidence of people who have not yet learned how quickly the future can change. It was a harder, quieter happiness, the satisfaction of someone who has found out what she is actually made of and found the answer adequate. She was 32 years old. She owned 47 acres of marsh that everyone in Savannah still believed was worthless. She lived in a cave carved out of ancient oyster shells. She had $12.40 in savings, a working boat, good equipment, one solid buyer, and experimental oyster beds that might come to nothing. and she was against all reasonable expectation, almost happy. There would be difficult things ahead. She understood this with the clarity of someone who has already survived several difficult things. Harlan would not leave her alone. She had seen it in his face in the lawyer's office. The calculation behind the smooth surface, the assessment of how this situation might yet be turned to his advantage. There would be battles she had not anticipated and obstacles she could not currently see. But she had the marsh, and the marsh had oysters, and the oysters tasted of good water. Old Cato had told her once long ago that learning to see what was actually there was the whole thing, was everything. She was beginning to understand what he had meant. The first of her cultivated beds showed results in late May. Nora had almost stopped checking. She had laid the shell rows in March with the careful attention of someone who understands that an experiment is only useful if you record what actually happens rather than what you hoped would happen. She had checked them weekly, noting in her ledger the absence of visible change, which was itself a form of data. Oyster larvae were invisible to the naked eye. The process of attachment and early growth happened at a scale she could not directly observe. She was working on faith informed by logic, which is a different thing from blind hope, though the distinction can be difficult to explain to someone who has not tried it. Then one morning in the last week of May, she pulled the boat up over the first row of shells and looked down through 4 feet of clear water, and she saw them. Small. Barely the size of her thumbnail, some of them smaller. A thin gray-white crust on the surfaces of the shells. She had placed dozens of them on each shell, hundreds across the row, a generation of oysters that had found exactly the substrate and location she had provided, and had decided in the wordless way that living things make decisions that this was a good place to be. She sat in the boat for a long time looking at them. She had not created them. The marsh had created them. What she had done was understand the marsh well enough to put the right conditions in the right place, and the marsh had done the rest. That was not a small thing. She was beginning to understand the entire art of it. She wrote 3 words in her ledger that evening, "Rows are working." Then she got back in the boat the next morning and laid another row. By June, she had 12 rows in 4 different sections of the creek system, each chosen for specific characteristics she had documented over the winter: tidal flow depth, salinity, at different states of the tide, proximity to the deeper channels where the coldest water ran. She was not yet certain which variables mattered most. She would not be certain for another season at least. But she was generating information, and information was the only thing that could eventually tell her. The established oystermen worked the natural beds the way men had worked them for generations. Arrive harvest, what was their leave? Nobody she knew of was doing what she was doing. She had asked careful questions of Dietrich Vogel, who had been in this business longer than she had been working the marsh, and he had confirmed what she suspected: cultivation of this kind was not practiced in coastal Georgia. There were stories of oyster farming in France, he said, and some experimentation in New England. But here the assumption was that the beds were simply a resource to be harvested, like timber or fish. The beds never run out, Nora had asked. Dietrich had paused in the way of a man who knows the answer to a question is more complicated than the question assumes. The good beds hold, he said finally. The less good beds get quieter over time. Nora had nodded and said nothing further, but she had written it down. She hired Silas Bream in August. She had been hearing his name for months in the way that you hear a name on the water mentioned in passing by Dietrich Vogel, as someone who knew the coastal creeks better than any man alive, mentioned again by old Amos the fisherman, as someone who had worked every inch of marsh between Savannah and the Carolina border in the 40 years since the war ended, and his life became technically his own. She found him on a Tuesday morning, sitting on the bank of a creek 3 miles from her property, repairing a cast net with the methodical patience of someone for whom patience is not a virtue, requiring effort but simply a description of how time works. He was in his middle 50s, lean and dark, with hands that looked like they had been doing hard work since before she was born. His face, when he looked up at her, had the particular quality of someone who has seen enough of the world's difficulty that nothing surprises him and very little impresses him. "You're the widow working the Alcott Marsh," he said. "I am." "I heard about you." He went back to the net. "You laid shell rows in the spring." "I did." He was quiet for a moment, pulling the net through his hands, checking each section of mesh. "Some people said that was a waste of good shell." "Some people were wrong," Nora said. He looked up at her again. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. They were, he agreed. I went and looked at your rows in June. Growth rate is better than the natural beds in the same section of creek. I didn't tell anyone that. Nora looked at him for a moment. Why not? Because it wasn't my information to share. He set the net aside. What are you offering? She told him. Standard day wages, the same rate as the dock workers in Savannah, plus a share of net profit if the operation grew to a defined size she specified. She had worked out the numbers in her ledger across several evenings, and she was confident in them, but she presented them without apology or excessive explanation, the way her father had always taught her to present a fair offer clearly without hedging. Silas Bream listened to the terms without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. I've worked for a lot of people in my life, he said. I've worked for people who thought working for them was something I should be grateful for. He paused. You're not one of those people. No, Nora said. I'm not. He looked at her steadily. I'll start Monday. What Silas knew about the marsh was the difference between reading a book and having lived the story. He knew where the deepest channels ran in every season, how the tidal patterns shifted between summer and winter, which creek sections produced best in drought years, when the salinity ran high, and which performed better in wet years when the freshwater mix changed. He knew how to read the behavior of the birds, the way the egrets moved when a weather system was building offshore, the specific call of the clapper rails that indicated the tide was about to turn. He taught her all of it without ceremony in the way that people who know things well share knowledge not as instruction but as conversation, as natural commentary on what they were both observing. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, by writing it down and then testing it against what she actually saw. In return, she showed him the ledgers. All of them, every record she had kept since November, every sale and expense, every note about the cultivated rows, every observation about water quality and oyster development and seasonal variation. She had never shown them to anyone. She showed them to Silas because she had already determined that the only way the operation could grow was if the people working it understood what they were building. He spent an evening reading through them, and at the cave entrance, in the last of the daylight, turning the pages carefully with his large hands. You're running this like a farm, he said finally. I grew up on a farm. Most people out here don't think that way. He closed the ledger. They think about what they can take out. You're thinking about what you can put in. He handed the ledger back. That's the whole difference. 2 weeks after Silas started, his wife, Hattie, appeared at the shucking area Nora had established on the high ground near the midden. Nora had been shucking her own oysters for the restaurants that paid premium for processed meat, a slow and imperfect process that limited how much of the harvest she could sell at the higher price point. Hattie Bream was a small woman who somehow managed to take up the precise amount of space that a situation required. She set down the bag she was carrying, looked at Nora's shucking setup, looked at Nora and said simply, "You're doing that wrong." Nora set down her knife. "Show me." And what Hattie could do with an oyster knife was not skill so much as a kind of fluency, the same quality you see in someone who has spoken a language since childhood, where the mechanics have dissolved into pure expression. Her knife found the hinge, applied exactly the right pressure at exactly the right angle, and the shell opened cleanly every time. The meat dropped whole and perfect into the receiving bucket. No shell fragments, no damage to the delicate flesh, faster than Nora could track. How long does a bushel take you? Nora asked. 40 minutes if I'm not rushing. Nora had been taking nearly 3 hours. What would you want, Nora said carefully, to do this work? Hattie named a rate, Nora countered. They reached an agreement in under 5 minutes with the brisk efficiency of two people who respect each other's time. That evening, Nora recalculated her ledger projections. With Hattie processing the harvest, the percentage she could sell as premium, shucked meat increased from roughly 15% to nearly 60%. The revenue numbers that resulted were different enough from her previous projections that she checked the arithmetic 3 times. The marsh was not just productive. The marsh properly worked was something else entirely. August arrived with the kind of heat that makes Savannah feel like the inside of a bread oven, the air thick and still, the tidal creek steaming in the early morning. Nora was working a deep bed near the mouth of her main channel when Dietrich Vogel appeared on the bank above her, which was unusual enough that she immediately shipped her tongs and paddled over. He had come himself rather than sending a message. That too was unusual. I had a visitor yesterday, he said, a hotel owner, the Hartwell House on Johnson Square. He asked me specifically for oysters from your operation. Nora kept her expression level. Did he? He had served them to a railroad executive 2 weeks ago. The man apparently declared them the finest oysters he had tasted in 30 years of eating oysters on the eastern seaboard. Dietrich paused with the measured delivery of a man who knows when information has value and allows it the appropriate weight. I told the hotel owner I could supply them. I'm telling you, I need to supply them. More volume. Consistently. Nora looked at him. What price? 60 cents. 70 for the deep water stock, 60 for standard. Dietrich considered this for approximately 4 seconds. Agreed. After he left, Nora sat in the boat for a while in the August heat listening to the marsh. A mullet jumped somewhere in the main channel. The cordgrass stood absolutely still. The tide was coming in slow and steady and inevitable the way it always did. She needed more people. She hired 2 more men in September, both freedmen who had worked with Silas on the rice plantations before the war ended and the plantation economy collapsed. Their names were Roscoe and Clement, and they had between them something close to a century of experience working the coastal marsh, though they had spent that experience producing rice rather than oysters. The knowledge transferred in ways that were not immediately obvious, the understanding of tidal flow, of how to move efficiently in marsh terrain, of when to work and when the water would not allow it. Silas brought them in the way a person brings someone into a household they trust with a brief introduction and the clear implication that his recommendation was sufficient. Nora hired them on the same terms she had given Silas, which they accepted with the matter-of-fact appreciation of men who had enough experience to recognize fair treatment by contrast with its absence. By October of 1890, she had 5 people working the operation. The cultivated beds were producing their first significant harvest. The oysters she had seeded in spring and summer had reached market size faster than the wild beds, in the same locations grown more uniformly, and produced a consistency of quality that she could now document across multiple harvests. She registered the business with the county. She had thought about what to name it for several weeks before settling on the answer, which had been obvious from the start. Not her own name, not Owen's name. She named it after the place, Alcott Oyster Company. The ledger that recorded this registration also recorded in the same week that the operation had, for the first time in a single month, earned more than the family farm had ever earned in its best full year. She sat with that number for a long time. The Savannah Morning News story appeared in February of 1891. A reporter named Whitmore had come out to the marsh the previous month, apparently following a tip from someone at one of the hotel accounts. He was not entirely clear about his source, and Nora did not press him. He had spent a full day with the operation, watching the harvesting, interviewing Silas, examining the cultivated beds at low tide, asking Hattie questions about the shucking process that Hattie answered with the careful precision of someone who does not waste words on people who might not be listening. The resulting article ran on the front page of the business section. Widow transforms worthless coastal marsh into thriving enterprise. Alcott Oyster Company stands as model of innovation in the new Southern economy. Nora read it at the kitchen table she had built from mill timber the previous spring. She read it twice. The article was accurate, which she had not entirely expected. Whitmore had understood what she was doing with the cultivated beds and had explained it clearly. He had described Silas as an essential partner in the operation, which was accurate and which she appreciated. He had quoted her once from an exchange she barely remembered. "The marsh teaches you if you are willing to learn." She folded the paper and set it aside. She knew with complete certainty that Harlan had read it. He appeared 3 weeks later on a cold afternoon in early March, and Nora saw him coming from across the marsh before he reached the shucking area, which gave her time to set down what she was working on and stand up straight and prepare herself. He came in a good carriage. He was wearing an excellent suit, charcoal gray with a silk cravat, his shoes polished to a shine that was clearly going to be challenged by the last 100 yards of marsh path between the road and where she was standing. She watched him navigate this distance with the focused displeasure of a man encountering a physical obstacle he considers beneath him. He stopped at the edge of the working area and looked around him with the expression of a man revising his estimates of something he had previously undervalued. "You've built something real here," he said. Nora said nothing. The newspaper article was impressive. The figures they quoted, he paused. I underestimated what you were capable of. Yes, Nora said, you did. Harlan looked at her with the particular expression she had known since childhood, the one that appeared when he was about to present an argument he had already decided was unanswerable. I have capital. I have connections in the city that you don't have. There are distribution channels I can open, contracts I can arrange that would allow this operation to triple in size within 2 years. Nora waited. I'm proposing a partnership. Equal terms. We put the past aside and we build something together that neither of us could build alone. The marsh was very quiet around them. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows 20 yards away, watching them both with the yellow eye of a creature that has no opinion on human affairs. The tide was coming in slow and steady. Get off my property, Nora said. Harlan's expression did not change immediately. It took a moment, like watching ice form the surface holding its shape while something underneath shifted. You're making a mistake. Owen never gambled, she said. But once in 12 years. You forged his name on a debt he never owed, and you arranged for witnesses to swear to something they never saw. And you did it before he was even in the ground. She looked at her brother steadily. I have nothing to say to you about partnership. I have nothing to say to you about anything. Get off my land. Harlan stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back across the marsh the way he had come, avoiding the mud, with less success on the return journey than the first. Silas, who had been working at the far end of the shucking area with his back turned and his hearing apparently quite good, said nothing. He continued working. After a moment, Nora continued working too. That evening, she wrote one sentence in her ledger. H came. H left. Watch for what comes next. What came next came in waves, and it came fast. In the last week of March, a lawyer she had never met delivered notice that a title search had identified an irregularity in the original deed to the Marsh property, a question about whether her father had acquired clear title from the previous holder, which would mean the chain of ownership was broken and her own claim uncertain. The notice was professionally worded and legally specific and entirely without merit, as Nora recognized within the first 2 paragraphs because she had spent a winter evening 2 months earlier reading through the complete chain of title on her property after Dietrich Vogel had mentioned that disputed title claims were a common form of harassment in the coastal land markets. She had been right to prepare. She had also been right that Harlan would not accept her refusal as a final answer. She hired Prescott Yarrow. He was an older man who practiced property law from an office on Bay Street that smelled of the same pipe tobacco and old leather as every lawyer's office Nora had ever entered, as though all lawyers shared a single source of these materials. He had the unhurried manner of someone who has been correct often enough that he no longer feels the need to perform certainty. He simply had it. He examined the deed. He traced the chain of ownership back 3 generations, assembling documentation that established beyond any reasonable challenge that the property had passed through legitimate conveyances to her father and from her father to her. The opposing lawyer withdrew the title claim before it reached a hearing after Prescott sent a letter indicating his intention to file a counteraction for malicious prosecution. That's the first one, Prescott told her when it was over. There will be more. There were more. The county assessor sent notification in April that the property had been reclassified. Its taxable value increased by a factor of 10 based on the commercial activity the newspaper article had documented. The assessment was technically arguable but practically devastating. At the new rate, the annual tax bill would consume most of the operation's profit. Nora appealed. She requested a formal review, and when the assessor arrived, she brought him to the property at high tide and let him see for himself what 47 acres of tidal marsh actually was. She walked him to the edge of the main creek and let him look at the water covering what was twice every day, without exception, genuine wetland, uninhabitable, and uncultivable by any conventional standard. She showed him her ledgers, not the income records, but the operational records, the documentation of how many hours of how much labor were required to produce the results the newspaper had described. The value here is not in the land, she told the assessor, with the patience of someone explaining something true. The land is the same land it has always been. The value is in the knowledge of how to work it and in the work itself. Take the knowledge away and you have a swamp. Take me and my people away and you have a swamp. The swamp does not become taxable at commercial rates because I figured out how to use it. The assessor had the uncomfortable expression of a man being presented with an argument he cannot easily dismiss. He agreed to a modest upward revision, significantly less than the tenfold increase he had originally proposed. It was not a complete victory. It was a manageable outcome, which was all she had asked for. In May, one of her established dealers sent notice that he would no longer be purchasing from Alcott Oyster Company, citing quality concerns that he declined to specify. Nora knew without being told that Harlan had reached him. She had been developing secondary relationships with other dealers throughout the spring precisely because she had expected something like this. The loss cost her. It did not break her. She replaced the volume within 6 weeks. It was in the worst week of the legal fights when the title claim and the tax assessment were both unresolved and the dealer cancellation had just arrived that Silas told her about himself. They were working the north beds at low tide, the late afternoon light lying gold and flat across the water, the cord grass throwing long shadows. She had been quiet for most of the day in the way that is not peaceful quiet, but rather the quiet of someone carrying a weight they cannot put down. Silas had worked alongside her without commenting on it, which she had appreciated. Then he said without preamble, and without looking up from what he was doing, "I was 14 years old when they sold me away from my mother." Nora went still. Sold me from a plantation outside Beaufort down to one in Louisiana, 600 miles. He was working the tongs steady and rhythmic the way he always worked. I didn't see my mother again. She died in '63. He paused. Hattie, I met her before the sale when I was 12. We knew each other for 2 years and then I was gone. I didn't find her again until 1868, 3 years after the war ended, looking for 3 years before I found her. The creek moved past them. Somewhere upstream, a fish jumped, and the ring spread out and faded. 20 years, Silas said. I lost 20 years of my life to men who decided what I was worth and what I was for. He lifted a cluster of oysters from the tongs, examined it, set the keepable ones in the boat. I'm not telling you this so you feel better about your own situation, because your situation is hard and it deserves to be called hard. He looked at her for the first time in the conversation. I'm telling you because I need you to understand something. What? Nora said. That they didn't win. His voice was level, matter of fact, the voice of someone stating a fact about weather or tide. All those men who decided what I was worth, what I was for, they are dead, or they are old, or they are nothing, and I am here. On water, I know better than they ever knew anything. He looked back at the creek. Whatever your brother does, he doesn't win unless you decide he does. Nora held this in silence for a moment. The water moved past them. The light was going. He forged Owen's name, she said. It was not a response to what Silas had said exactly. It was something she had not said aloud to anyone before. Not mine. Owen's. Owen was already sick when Harlan prepared that document. I think Harlan knew Owen was going to die and prepared it in advance, so that when Father died, the debt would be there waiting. Silas said nothing. He worked. Owen was a good man, Nora said. He was not interesting, and he was not exciting, and he made me laugh about once a year, and he was a good man. He deserved better than to have his name put on a lie by someone who knew he wasn't coming back to dispute it. Yes, Silas said simply. He did. They worked until the tide turned and made them stop. On the way back to the bank, in the last gray light, Nora thought about what Silas had said, not as consolation, as measurement. He had set a scale against which she could place her own situation and find it both as genuinely hard and genuinely survivable. Those two things could be true at the same time. She had not clearly understood that before. She would not forget it. By midsummer of 1891, Alcott Oyster Company employed 15 people and was shipping oysters as far north as Atlanta on the new rail connections that had been making the Georgia interior accessible to coastal goods for the past decade. The cultivated beds were now producing a third of total harvest volume with higher average quality and greater consistency than the wild beds. Nora had maps of the entire property marked with the locations of every bed cultivated and natural, with notes on seasonal performance, optimal harvest timing, and the particular characteristics of each section of the creek system. She had also built a proper shucking house on the high ground near the midden, a timber frame building with good ventilation, a proper cold storage area using blocks of ice she had arranged to have delivered twice a week from a Savannah ice dealer, and enough workspace for 6 shuckers working simultaneously. Hattie ran the shucking operation with a quiet authority that nobody questioned. The shucked meat they produced was the finest quality available anywhere between Savannah and Charleston, and the restaurants and hotels that served it knew it. The cave was still there. Nora had not dismantled it, had not converted it to storage, or filled it in. It stood at the edge of the property, the way certain things stand as a reference point, as a measure of distance traveled. Some evenings after the work was done and the ledger was updated, and the shucking house was closed and dark, she would sit at the cave entrance and listen to the tide moving through the creeks. She was not sentimental about it. She was clear-eyed about what it had been, a cold stone space where she had spent a winter alone eating oysters and roasted acorns, was learning how to survive in a place nobody else wanted. There was no poetry in that. It had simply been necessary, and she had done it. But she kept the hearth clean. She kept the wooden door functional. She kept it as a fact about herself, something she could return to when she needed to remember what she was capable of. The marsh had a storm building. She could see it in the way the birds were moving, the patterns Silas had taught her, the particular restlessness of the egrets, the way the sound of the cordgrass had changed to something lower and more urgent. Not today, not tomorrow maybe, but soon. She went back to the shucking house and began checking the storm preparations she had been making for the past week. She had learned enough by now to see what was actually there. The storm came on a Thursday. Nora had been watching it build for 4 days, the sky changing color in the evenings, from orange to a bruised greenish gray, the wind shifting and backing the birds moving inland in numbers that Silas said he had not seen since a bad storm 15 years earlier. She had spent those 4 days doing everything she could do. She had pulled the 2 smaller boats up onto the high ground and lashed them to the largest pine trees at the property's edge. She had weighted down the shucking house roof with timber and secured the doors with rope. She had moved the ice supply in the processed inventory to the most protected corner of the building. She had walked every section of the cultivated beds and done the math she did not want to do, which was the math of how much she stood to lose. The answer was considerable. On Wednesday evening, Silas stood beside her at the edge of the main creek, looking at the water, which was moving in a way that water does not normally move, too fast, too urgent, as though it already knew what was coming and was trying to get somewhere safe before it arrived. "How bad?" Nora asked. Silas looked at the sky for a long moment. "Bad enough," he said. She sent everyone home that evening. There was nothing more to be done that human hands could accomplish against what was coming, and keeping people on the property meant keeping them in danger. Silas argued briefly about leaving, then saw her expression and went. Nora stayed. She did not make this decision dramatically or with any particular sense of heroism. She stayed because the property was hers and the work was hers, and she found, when she examined the question honestly, that she was less afraid of the storm than she was of being somewhere else when it arrived helpless in waiting for news. She brought the boat that could not be moved, the largest one which she had built to replace the original bateau, and which was too heavy for her to drag up the bank alone to the most sheltered section of the main channel, and tied it to 4 separate trees with every length of rope she owned. Then she went into the cave. The storm hit in the middle of the night. She had experienced storms before. She had grown up in Georgia and understood that the coast had its own relationship with weather, that what came off the Atlantic in late summer and fall was a different order of phenomenon from the inland thunderstorms of her childhood. She had understood this intellectually. The understanding became physical somewhere around 2 in the morning, when the wind found a register she had never heard before, not the whistle and howl of ordinary storms, but a sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, as though the air itself had decided to become something else. The marsh midden shook. She could feel it through the walls, through the packed shell and compressed centuries of the place, a vibration that she would not have believed possible in something so solid. She stayed near the back of the cave, away from the door, listening. Water came under the door in sheets. The chimney breathed backward for a period and filled the space with smoke until she blocked it with a piece of wet sacking. The fire died. She sat in the dark with her back against the shell wall and listened to the storm take pieces of her work apart outside. There was nothing to be done. That was the specific lesson of that night, delivered without mercy and without apology. There are forces against which preparation is useful, and forces against which it is not. And wisdom consists in knowing which is which. She had prepared as much as she could. Now she sat in the dark and waited. She thought about her father, who had sat through storms in that farmhouse, 20 miles inland, and never once to her knowledge been afraid. She thought about Owen, who had been afraid of storms and had never admitted it, and who she had always pretended not to notice gripping the porch railing during thunderstorms with the studied casualness of a man proving something to himself. She thought about old Cato out on the water he had worked his whole life, and whether he had a safe place to wait out nights like this. She thought about the oyster beds. Dawn came gray and quiet at the silence after the storm, having a different quality from ordinary silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of exhaustion, as though the air itself needed to rest. Nora opened the cave door and looked out at what remained. The storm surge had reached the high ground. The midden itself stood clear. Its elevation had held, as she had trusted it would, the accumulated wisdom of the people who had chosen this site centuries ago, proving its value one more time. But the marsh below was a landscape of damage. Two of the smaller boats she had lashed to the trees had broken their lines and were gone. The shucking house was standing, but its roof had been partially stripped, the timber weights insufficient against what had actually come. Three of the ice storage walls had collapsed. She walked the property for 2 hours in the gray morning, making notes. The cultivated beds she found had sustained significant disruption, the shell rows scattered by the surge, and the turbulent water months of carefully placed substrate displaced. The wild beds were in better condition, their age and depth giving them a resilience the younger cultivated beds lacked. She stood at the edge of the main channel and looked at the scattered evidence of her experimental rows for a long time. Then she went back to the shucking house and began clearing debris. Silas arrived mid-morning, followed by Roscoe and Clement and Hattie, and all of them appearing at different times through the morning as roads became passable, each of them taking in the damage with the assessing eyes of people who know hard work and move toward it without discussion. Hattie went directly to the shucking house. Silas walked the beds with Nora, making his own notes, saying little. "The cultivated rows," Nora said. "We can relay them," Silas said. "We know where they go now. The second time will be faster." "How much of the season do we lose?" He considered. "Some. The wild beds will carry us through." They worked for 14 days without a full day off, repairing the shucking house roof with timber hauled from a mill in Savannah, rebuilding the ice walls, recovering the boats. One found a mile downstream, damaged but repairable one never found. They relayed the cultivated bed rows from the shell inventory Nora had been accumulating, working with the efficiency of people who had done this before and knew the creek bottom as well as they knew their own hands. On the 15th day, the operation was running again. Not at full capacity, at something close enough. That evening, eating at the table outside the shucking house with Silas and Hattie, while the marsh settled into its evening sounds around them, Nora said, "We lost 18 days of revenue." "Yes," Silas said, "and we're still here." Silas looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over the past year, the one that meant he was deciding whether to say something direct. "I've worked for people," he said, "who would have quit after that storm. People who had more resources than you had when you started." He looked at the marsh. "The land doesn't care what you've put into it. You understand that. Most people don't." Hattie, who rarely commented on matters outside the shucking house's operations, said without looking up from her plate, "Most people don't deserve it when they get it." It was the closest thing to a compliment that Hattie Bream delivered, and Nora received it in the spirit intended. What she did not know until 10 days after the storm did not know, because she had been occupied entirely with rebuilding and had not been to Savannah and had not spoken with anyone from the city, was that the same storm surge that had disrupted her cultivated beds had also flooded the Alcott family farm. She learned it from Dietrich Vogel, who told her in the manner of a man conveying information he considers relevant without wishing to appear to take pleasure in it. The surge had come further inland than anyone had predicted. The low fields of the farm, the best fields, the ones that had been in production since her grandfather cleared them, had been inundated with salt water. Not briefly, long enough for the salt to work into the soil. "How bad?" Nora asked. "My understanding is significant. The tenant farmers your brother hired have already left. The fields won't produce anything useful for at least 2 seasons, possibly more, depending on how well the drainage is managed." Dietrich paused. "Your brother, I am told, has debts against the farm that were predicated on ongoing production." Nora said nothing. I thought you should know, Dietrich said with the quiet courtesy of someone who understood that this information was both significant and complicated. She drove back to the marsh in the borrowed wagon through the October afternoon along the road that still showed signs of the storm's passage branches, across the verge, a section of fence knocked flat, a low area that had not yet fully drained. She thought about Harlan in his charcoal suit picking his way across the marsh path to offer her a partnership. She thought about the forged document with Owen's signature. She thought about the title claim and the tax assessment and the dealer who had stopped buying and the boats untied in the night. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was satisfaction. What she felt was something harder to name, a kind of tired recognition, the feeling of watching something inevitable arrive. She had not done this to Harlan. The storm had not done it to Harlan. Harlan had done it to himself the way people who build on other people's foundations eventually do when the foundation turns out to be unreliable. She felt no satisfaction. She felt no particular mercy either. She felt the strange neutrality of someone watching a fact complete itself. Harlan came in October on a day when the marsh had settled back into its autumn rhythms, the cord grass going to gold and copper, the water cold enough to see your breath in the early morning. Nora was at the shucking house supervising the processing of the day's harvest when she saw him coming down the marsh path. He was on foot, no carriage, no suit. He was wearing clothes that were decent but plain, and his shoes were the shoes of a man who had stopped worrying about what his shoes communicated. He looked smaller than she remembered, which she knew was not a physical reality, but a function of what was no longer surrounding him. The confidence, the calculation, the assurance of a man who believed he controlled the terms of every situation he entered. He stopped at the edge of the working area. He did not look around at the operation the way he had in March performing reassessment. He looked at Nora. "The farm is gone," he said. "The salt water killed the fields. The tenants left. I have debts I cannot service without the income the farm was supposed to generate." He stopped. "I have no one else." Nora set down what she was holding. Around her, Hattie and the two shuckers continued working because Hattie had communicated without words that this was not a situation that required the room to stop. "Tell me what you actually want," Nora said. "I need help. I don't know what form that takes. I don't know what you'd be willing to—" He stopped again. Something was working in his face, something she had never seen there before, which was the visible effort of a man trying to say a true thing. "I know what I did was wrong. I knew it when I did it. I did it anyway." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you to decide what, if anything, you're willing to do for someone who doesn't deserve your help." The marsh was quiet around them. The tide was going out, the water dropping in the creek, oyster clusters beginning to emerge along the channel edges. A white ibis picked its way along the far bank with a deliberate concentration of something that knows exactly what it is looking for. Nora looked at her brother. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at the marsh, not for what she expected to see, but for what was actually there. What was actually there was a man who had made choices and followed them to their conclusion, and arrived at this marsh path with nothing left but the plain truth of what he had done. It was not redemption. Redemption required time and action and consistent evidence of genuine change. This was something smaller and more immediate: honesty, without an audience, without leverage, without anything to gain from it, except the small and insufficient relief of saying the actual thing. It was she supposed to start. "I have a proposition for you," she said. "The same proposition you made me 2 years ago." Harlan waited. "Sign the farm over to me. Everything, whatever remains, whatever its current condition, whatever debts are attached. Sign it fully and completely." She met his eyes. "And we are even." Harlan held her gaze for a moment. She watched him process this, the remnants of the calculating mind, working through the offer, looking for hidden conditions, finding none. "Agreed," he said. "We'll go to Savannah tomorrow. Prescott Yarrow will prepare the documents." Harlan nodded. He turned to go. "Harlan." He stopped. "Owen never gambled," she said. "Not once. You knew that." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I knew that." He walked back up the marsh path. Nora watched him go. Then she picked up what she had set down and went back to work. They completed the transfer in Prescott Yarrow's office on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 years and 3 weeks after the first transfer had taken place in the same building, before the same desk, with Nora standing at the same window looking out at the same orderly streets of Savannah. The symmetry of it was not lost on her. She did not remark on it. Prescott witnessed the signing with the careful attention of a lawyer who had been present for both transactions and understood what he was looking at. When it was done, he looked at Nora with the question that was not quite a question. "There are decisions to make about the property," she said. "I'll need a few days." She drove back to the marsh. She had thought about this before Harlan arrived. Not the specific form of his return, which she could not have predicted, but the question underneath it, which she had been turning over for months in the quiet of the early mornings and the long evenings when the work was done and the marsh settled into its nighttime self. What was the farm for? Not in the abstract, in the specific. Who would work it? What would they do with it? Who needed it most? And who was most likely to make it into something that justified the work of recovery? She knew the answer. She had known it probably since she hired Silas and watched him read her ledgers in the last of the evening light and say that she was thinking about what she could put in rather than what she could take out. She brought Silas to the cave that evening. They sat at the entrance the way they sometimes did after long days looking out at the marsh in the fading light. The cordgrass dark against the pale sky, the creek moving with the tide. "The farm," she said. Silas looked at her. "I want to organize a cooperative. Freedmen who know farming men who've been working other people's land since the war ended and have never had the chance to work their own." She looked at him. "You know who those men are?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "I know some of them," he said carefully. "The farm is damaged, but not beyond recovery. 2 seasons, maybe 3, with proper drainage management in the right hands, it will produce again." She paused. "I want to sell it to the cooperative for nothing. And I want to set up a loan equipment and seed money repaid from production once the farm becomes profitable. Fair terms, clear contracts, no conditions I don't state plainly at the beginning." Silas looked at her for a long time with that expression she had come to know, the one that was not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a man recalibrating an estimate he had thought was already as high as it could go. "That's your father's land," he said. "Your grandfather's land." "It's land," Nora said. "It belongs to the people who will work it and mean it." "Your brother stole it from you." "Yes, and I got it back. And now I'm deciding what it's actually for." She looked at the marsh. "I don't want to be a landlord, Silas. I don't want to be someone who holds land over other people's heads. I have this place. This is enough." Silas was quiet for a long time. The tide was coming in, moving through the creek with the steady sound she had been falling asleep to for 2 years. An owl called somewhere in the pine trees at the property's edge once, twice, then silence. "I know 7 men," Silas said finally. "Good farmers. 3 of them were on the Beaufort plantations before the war. 2 more worked tobacco in Virginia. The other 2 have been sharecropping outside Savannah since '68 and never once gotten a fair accounting from their landlord." He paused. "They're careful men. They've had to be." "Bring them to me, Yirfinama," Nora said. "I want to meet them before anything is decided. I want them to see the land before they agree to anything. Fair decisions require full information." Silas nodded slowly. Then he said, "What about Harlan?" Nora had thought about this too. She had thought about it the way you think about a problem that has only one honest answer, which is to look at it directly until the answer becomes clear. "He goes to Charleston, I think. He'll find something there. He's not a stupid man, and he's not without ability. He made bad choices." She paused. "I'll write to him twice a year. I won't pretend what happened didn't happen. I won't pretend it doesn't matter. But I won't carry it forever either." "That's more than he deserves," Silas said. "Probably." Nora agreed. It's what I can live with." The cooperative was organized over the following 6 weeks, with Silas recruiting the men he had named and 3 others he thought of later, and Nora meeting each of them at the farm property before any agreement was made. She walked the land with them, showed them the salt-damaged fields and the sections that had been above the flood line, and survived intact, explained the drainage work that would need to be done and the timeline she estimated for recovery. She was honest about the damage and honest about the potential. She did not oversell either. Prescott Yarrow drew up the contracts. They were clear and specific and weighted toward the cooperative members. Nora had been explicit about this with Prescott, who had raised one careful eyebrow and then drafted exactly what she asked for. The cooperative took ownership. The loan for equipment and seed carried no interest, and repayment began only when the first profitable season was documented by an agreed-upon accounting method. The signing took place on a cold morning in December of 1891 in Prescott's office with 7 men, and Silas gathered around the desk and Nora standing to one side watching each of them sign their names or make their marks on documents that gave them something most of them had spent their adult lives without. One of the men, his name was Elwood, a quiet man in his late 40s who had farmed tobacco in Virginia, looked up from signing and looked at Nora and said, "Why?" It was a real question, not rhetorical, not performative. He genuinely wanted to know. "Because the land should belong to people who will work it," Nora said, "and because someone taught me that what you put in matters more than what you take out." Silas, standing across the room, did not look at her, but the slight shift in his expression told her he had heard. She returned to the marsh. Not dramatically, not as a statement. She simply went back to work the way she always did because the tides did not pause for transfers of title or moments of significance, and the oyster beds required attention regardless of what was happening in Savannah. The winter of 1891 into 1892 was productive. The rebuilt cultivated rows were performing at higher yields than before the storm, partly because the disruption had allowed her to relocate several rows to positions she had identified as better during the months of post-storm assessment, and partly because the oysters themselves seemed she was careful in her ledger notes about this writing, appears to indicate rather than indicates to respond well to being restarted on clean shell in optimal positions. She hired 3 more people in January. By spring of 1892, the operation employed 12 full-time workers, not counting the shuckers Hattie managed on a seasonal basis. The payroll was the largest single expense in the ledger, and also Nora had decided the most important investment she made. She had thought about this carefully. The men and women who worked Alcott Oyster Company had options in the sense that anyone who can work has options, but their options were limited in the specific way that options are limited when you are a freedman in Georgia in 1892, which is to say that the theoretical freedom to work elsewhere existed alongside the practical reality of limited opportunity, frequent exploitation, and work conditions that made Nora's offer steady wages, fair accounting, clear terms of respect as a matter of course, rather than a concession, genuinely exceptional. She was aware of this, and she was aware that being aware of it did not resolve the underlying conditions that made it true. What she could do was run her operation the way that should be run, treat the people who worked it the way they deserved to be treated, and build something that demonstrated in the specific, concrete, observable way that a working business demonstrates things, that this approach was not charity, but good practice. The quality of the work bore this out. The attention and care that Silas and Hattie and Roscoe and Clement and the others brought to the operation was not separate from the conditions of the operation. It was a response to them. By 1893, Alcott Oyster Company had expanded to 2 additional harvest locations, both leased from landowners who had noticed what Nora had built and preferred to take a percentage of a successful operation over full ownership of unused marsh. Silas managed the day-to-day operations of the satellite locations with 2 crews working under him, traveling between sites with the efficient familiarity of a man who has known this water his whole life. Nora went to every site at least twice a week. She never stopped working the beds herself. Silas had suggested diplomatically that her time might be better spent on the business management that was increasingly demanding her attention, the correspondence with buyers, the negotiations with the rail freight companies, the accounting that had grown from a single ledger to 3 separate books. She had listened to him politely and continued working the beds. "You could hire someone to do the harvesting," he said once directly. "I know," she said, "but you won't." "I need to know what the water is doing," she said. "I can't know that from the shore." He had not argued further. He understood she thought that the harvesting was not only about knowing the water, that there was something in the physical work itself, that she required some connection to the original terms of her survival, that she was not ready to dissolve into management and administration. The cave was still there. She still slept in it occasionally when a long day ended with her too tired to ride back to Savannah, or when she simply wanted to hear the tide at night. She had built a proper house by then on the high ground overlooking the main channel, 4-room cypress and heart pine, a wide porch facing the marsh windows positioned to catch the breeze. It was comfortable without being elaborate. She had furnished it herself, buying pieces in Savannah over several months as the budget allowed, and the result was a house that looked like someone actually lived in it rather than one decorated to signal something about its owner. She had thought about marriage. She would not have been honest if she had said otherwise. There had been men Dietrich Vogel had introduced her to a colleague once with the careful indirection of a man who wants to be helpful without being presumptuous, and the colleague had been agreeable and had seemed genuinely interested. There had been others in the natural way that a successful woman in her mid-30s in a commercial port city encounters interested men. She had not found the right person, which was true, but she also was not sure the right person was what she was looking for, which was a harder truth and one she held without apology. Owen had been the right person, and the right person had died. What she had built since was not a substitute for that and did not need to be. It was its own thing, a life organized around work she believed in and people she trusted and a piece of land that had taught her everything she needed to know about herself. That was enough. It was, if she was being precise, more than enough. Silas and Hattie became formal partners in 1894. Nora had been preparing the documents for 6 months before she brought them to Silas, working with Prescott Yarrow to structure an arrangement that was genuine rather than nominal, a real equity stake in the company, real profit sharing, real decision-making authority, commensurate with the role Silas had been playing in the operation for 4 years. The documents were straightforward. Prescott had made them so. She gave them to Silas on an evening in April at the table outside the shucking house without ceremony or speech. She set the documents down and said, "Prescott drew these up. They say what I intend them to say. Read them when you have time." Silas looked at the documents. He looked at her. He picked them up and took them home. 3 days later, he came back and said, "The profit percentage? Yes, it's generous. It's what you've earned," Nora said. "The percentage reflects what the operation would look like without your knowledge and your work, which is to say it would look considerably smaller and considerably less successful." Silas held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. Hattie, when Nora told her the arrangement included her specifically, and not only as Silas's spouse, looked at the documents for a long time and then looked at Nora with an expression that Nora had not seen on Hattie's face before, which was the expression of someone being surprised by the world in a direction they had not anticipated. "You worked for it too," Nora said simply. Hattie nodded once and went back to the shucking house. In the spring of 1895, she took a day away from the operation entirely, which she did rarely, and only when she needed to think clearly about something that required the full attention she could not give it while also running a business. She walked the property from one end to the other the way she had walked it that first November, 6 years earlier, when it had been 47 acres of saltwater marsh that everyone in Savannah believed was worthless. The cordgrass was beginning its spring green, coming up bright at the base through the previous year's pale, dry stalks. The creeks were running clear and cold, the tide coming in strong through the main channel, the water the color of dark glass in the morning light. She walked to the cultivated beds and looked at them, the rows now extending through 7 sections of the creek system, the oldest of them in their 5th year of production, the oysters growing with the reliable consistency she had spent 4 seasons learning to produce. She walked to the wild beds and looked at them, still producing, still the foundation of the operation, the natural beds that had been there before she arrived and would be there long after. She walked to the midden. She stood at the cave entrance and looked in at the hearth she had built from creek stones and clay, the earthen floor, the rough timber of the reinforced entrance. The door still worked. The hearth was clean. It looked like what it was, a place where someone had learned to survive and then had done so. She thought about the sequence of things. Owen dying, her father dying, the lawyer's office and Harlan's signature, and the deed to 47 acres of nothing. The cold November morning when she had stood at the edge of this marsh and felt for the first time something other than grief and fury. The oyster she had opened with her father's knife. The laugh that had come out of her without permission. The boat she had built with inadequate tools and excessive determination. The first 3 bushels, 30 cents a bushel, in a warehouse that smelled of the sea. Old Cato's voice across 20 years, learning to see what's actually there, that's the whole thing. Silas reading her ledgers in the evening light, saying she was thinking about what she could put in. Hattie's knife finding the hinge of an oyster, with the fluency of a language spoken since childhood. The storm coming through, taking what it took, leaving what it left. Harlan on the marsh path with his plain clothes and his bare true thing. The cooperatives signing their names on cold December morning, owning their land for the first time. All of it connected. All of it running through this place like the tide ran through the creek in and out twice a day carrying what it carried. Nora sat down in the cave entrance, the way she had sat 6 years ago, on the earthen floor with her back against the shell wall, and stayed there for a while. The tide was making its sound in the creek. The marsh smelled the way it always smelled, salt and mud, and life underneath everything complex and ancient and indifferent and entirely itself. She thought of something she would say years later to the children of the men and women who worked the operation, Silas and Hattie's grandchildren, Roscoe's daughters, the young people who had grown up watching the company and knew no other version of what work and fair treatment looked like. She would bring them here to this cave, and they would look at the crude hearth and the earthen floor and the woven grass door, and they would ask why she kept it. "This is where I learned who I was," she would tell them. "Your uncle, some of you, someone took everything you thought you needed. And this place taught me that everything I actually needed was already inside me." But that was years away yet. In the spring of 1895, Alcott Oyster Company was the largest oyster operation on the Georgia coast. 53 people worked it full and part-time in a stretch of productive tidal marsh that the tax records of Chatham County, still despite Nora's long legal battle with the assessor, undervalued by a factor of several. The farm that Harlan had taken was producing again. Nora had heard this from Silas, who had heard it from one of the cooperative members who had ridden into Savannah with a wagon of produce and mentioned it in passing. The drainage work had been completed the previous fall. The first full season of crops was in the ground. The fields her grandfather had cleared were going to come back. Harlan was in Charleston. He wrote twice a year brief letters that reported on his circumstances with the plain factuality of someone who had used up their capacity for performance and arrived at something like honesty. He had found work as a bookkeeper for a shipping company. He was adequate at it, he wrote, which was the most accurate self-assessment she had ever read from him. He asked after the marsh operation once in his second letter with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She answered the question. They would never be close. The space between what had happened and what a normal sibling relationship required was too large, and neither of them was inclined to pretend otherwise. But the letters continued, and she wrote back, and there was something in that exchange, not warmth, not forgiveness exactly, but the acknowledgement of a shared history and the decision to carry it without letting it define everything else. That was what she had with Harlan. It was not much, it was what was honest. On the last evening of that spring survey of the property, Nora stood on the porch of the marsh house as the light went down, watching the tide move through the main channel below. The cord grass was green and tall. The herons were working the shallows. The water was exactly the color it always was in the evening dark and moving and full of what it carried. She had 47 acres of saltwater marsh. She had a company that employed more than 50 people and supplied restaurants and hotels from Savannah to Atlanta and north to the Carolina border. She had a house she had built and furnished herself. She had Silas and Hattie, who were her partners in the truest sense, the people who understood what she was building and had helped her build it and shared in what it had become. She had the cave in the midden where she had learned who she was. She had spent 6 years turning what everyone called worthless into something that could not be argued with. Not to prove something to Harlan, though she had proven it, not to prove something to the tax assessor or the dealers who had offered her 30 cents when she deserved 60. She had done it because the marsh had shown her on a cold November morning with an oyster and a knife, and the memory of an old man's voice that value is not always visible from a distance. That what looks like nothing from the road can be everything when you get close enough to see what is actually there. The tide came in, the tide went out. The oysters grew in their rows clean and cold and perfect in the dark water, tasting of the place they came from, tasting of good water and good work and the particular quality of a life built on what everyone else had thrown away. Nora stayed on the porch until the light was gone and the marsh was only sound in the darkness, the water moving the cordgrass in the night wind, the cry of a night heron somewhere out in the dark. Then she went inside.